Now that we have all the other pieces in place to work with the database, let's start creating our controllers and views and making them work with that data. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and go back to our index view in the home page. So there's views, home, index, and I want to modify some of this text. We'll wipe this all out, and I'm going to put another action link in there, and this time we're going to change it to be view students, and we'll call the controller, we'll do an index, and we're going to work with the student controller, and we are not going to pass it any parameters. And so this will now say, this link will show up, and when clicked on, it's going to go to the index action method found in the student controllers, which should actually show an index view in the student controller, which we'll make a little bit later. So we'll go ahead and save that build just to make sure we don't have any problems. And now let's go create our controller. So I'm going to scroll up over to my controller folder, right mouse click, and I'm going to need to add, right mouse click, add, and I want to add a controller. And I want to work with an empty controller, so click add, and we're going to call this controller student. And we will go ahead and click add. So within our student controller, we can now go ahead and write our index action method. We already have one right now, but what we need to do is we need to attach all this to the database. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a variable of type Hard Knocks context. In fact, if you notice, it's struggling a little bit trying to find that name, Hard Knocks context, and the reason being is because maybe it doesn't understand who that class is. But we'll call it a variable name. We're just going to call it DB. You could call it anything. And then we're going to call the constructor for Hard Knocks context. And now let's go resolve that. Right mouse click, resolve, and that's because I needed to use that folder. So if I had just typed in this statement at the very beginning, it would have understood who this was. Now, one thing we still need to do here is remember, when you create an object, you call the constructor method, but you always have to use the keyword new. So create a new object of type Hard Knocks Hard Knocks context, store it to the DB variable, which is expecting a Hard Knocks context variable. Now, if you remember, if I come back over to my DAL folder, here's that Hard Knocks context. That variable, DB, is of type DB context, and it contains access to the DB sets of the models, meaning that this controller, that's the DB context, this variable we just created of type Hard Knocks context is going to be a reference to a database object. Now I can come into my actual action method, and I'm going to type in the following. So I went ahead and typed in this statement. It says declare a variable called student underscore majors. Remember, C# is case sensitive. Of type IEnumerable, meaning a collection or a list of something. And a list of what? Student major models. So this will represent 0 to many student major model objects, or in other words, a collection of data. And how do we get that collection of data? By assigning to it the results of the database variable. Remember, that's our DB context variable we created in the Hard Knocks context. We've got our Hard Knocks context over here, and then we actually said, let's go create a variable right here called DB of type Hard Knocks context. So DB context dot database dot run a SQL query returning data of type student majors model, which it now says take the results of this and make sure that all the fields that we're bringing back match the fields over in this model. That's a nice little error checker also. And they don't have to be in the same order, but just make sure the spelling is correct, and also make sure this spelling matches your database tables. And then we did a from with an inner join, and then we did an order by. Now, notice that I leave a space at the end of each of these strings that I'm concatenating, and that's because otherwise it would jam everything up together and you'd get an error. And then I just concatenate with the plus sign. So this query is going to go and grab all of the students along with their major ID and their description and return it back, matching it to this model. And that whole collection, or that list that came back from the select statement, is going to be assigned to this variable, which says I'm expecting a list of data that matches that model. Now we have a resolve on there, so right mouse click on those errors and let's bring in our model to resolve that. Now the last thing you have to do, now you have this variable which will have all the data in it. We need to pass that model to the view. And the way you do it is you simply go inside the parentheses and you say pass that object. So this object, which has a list of all this data that gets returned, will get sent to the view called index. Now we need to make that view still. So right mouse click in the view area and choose add view. And we give it a name, index. We actually want it to be with a model. So click on the down arrow, and we want this to be a list. And this is a scaffolded template. So you choose list, and it means it's going to go and create the view for you and create the HTML needed to display all the data. You then click on model and go choose the model we're working with, which is student majors. And then you say, what database object do you have? We have our Hard Knocks context. Click add, and it now scaffolds and creates that new view, linking it to the model. Right up here at the top it says, hey, this view uses Razor, a model, which is an IEnumerable, meaning 0 to many records, of type MVC first, my first MVC models student major. So this view is now aware of the structure of that model, and that model data was loaded up in the controller, and the controller passed it to the view, so this view now has access to all that. And then we drop down into here and it says let's make a table, an HTML table with a row, and on that first row we're going to have a table header of, and then this is called an HTML helper. It says create a HTML tag to go out and grab the display name, or in other words the column name for the student first name in the model. So it will grab that column name from the database table and display that. And we do that for each of the columns in the database. And that right there displays a header going across on the screen. Now that we have our header in place, now we need to go grab all the records. Well, how do you do that? If there's one or more records, you'd use a loop to do it. So we use Razor and say @ for each item in the model, and it will grab record one at a time and throw it into that variable. We just specify the var type because it's generic. So grab the first record, throw it in the variable, and what do we do with it? We use a different HTML helper called display for. Display name for grabs the column name, display for grabs the actual data in the column. And then we say go grab the data student first name in the item that's in the model. And so we display all of the column information for that record we have, plus we add an action link to edit, to show the details, and to delete that record if we wanted. So let's go ahead and save that. And now that we have it, let's build it, see if we have any errors, which we don't. So let's go ahead and go back to our index, our main index file, which was our Hard Knocks logo and everything. We're going to run that. Here's our new link we just created, which if you look down at the bottom corner of your screen, look down over here when I put my cursor on there, it says go to the student controller, and by default, if there's not an action method then, with that controller name, it's going to call index. So let's see if that works. And here's all the records from our database now. And notice that this pulls the column name out of the table. Now you didn't have to do that. You could have just displayed anything you wanted on that HTML tag. And then this is your for each, which says go grab each of the records and display the data. We now have all the information necessary to actually show all the data in a data set within the DB context attached to the web config that's attached to our database.